This is the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of February 17th, 2020. This week I thought I'd go back to basics and talk a little bit about splitters. Why? Because a customer asked me actually whether it was possible to distribute everything to all the TVs in their home using splitters. They wanted to use Ethernet splitters, coaxial cable splitters, RCA cable splitters, every kind of splitter imaginable. And I had to explain there are some things that really work pretty well with splitters and some things that don't, and some things that don't work at all, which, for example, you really can't use a splitter with Ethernet. You can use a switch or a hub, but not just a dumb splitter. So a splitter itself is a relatively simple piece of electronics. If you think about it, it's really just like something that would divert half the water to one location and half the water to another location. You see, I often use water as a way to explain how electricity works because a lot of ways they are very similar. One won't get you wet and one won't electrocute you, but in the way they flow, there's actually a lot of similarities. A simple splitter works pretty well with digital signals. Analog signals are okay for splitters until they are not. It tends to be a case where you get a lot more noise when you split with analog because you're not just sending zeros and ones, and you lose half of the volume anytime you split. Half of the signal is really what I mean by that. And anytime you split, because there really is no such thing as a free lunch, anytime you split, well, half of what you got goes in one location, half of what you've got goes in the other. With digital signals, that's far less important. And we refer to digital signal loss in terms of it being 3 dB. We use that term for analog too, but it's more important that we talk about digital signals, especially since almost all signals today are digital. You can split off a digital signal a number of times, even 8 or 16 times before you run into trouble, but you will eventually run into trouble. Eventually, you'll get to the point where the amount of signal that's there is overwhelmed by the amount of noise. Generally, what you do is you get to a point just before that, and then you use an amplifier that reads that signal, amplifies it, and sends it back down the line with a much stronger wave behind it, as it were, a much stronger amount of current that will let the signal overwhelm the noise that's inherent in the line. So splitters are not the perfect solution for everything, but the nice thing is that they are a decent solution for a lot of things. It is possible to oversplit. It is possible even to undersplit, depending on what you're doing. In commercial applications, it's actually possible to have a signal that's too strong for what you're going to be using it for. You do this all the time in cable television head ends, for example, where you put out this incredibly strong signal that would just fry the tuner on any individual television because you know you're going to be splitting it and you know you're going to be sending it down long runs. So you're going to lose a lot of that before it gets to the television, and you don't worry about the fact that it's scorchingly hot right at the amplifier. A splitter is something that you should definitely have in your toolkit, but you should always have the right splitter for the job. One of the other things this particular customer was asking me about was if they could use a coaxial splitter and just use adapters to try to turn it into an RCA splitter. Well, look, this is going to work. It isn't going to work well, but it is going to work. You know, the problem is that each one of those adapters is bringing in more noise and cutting signal just by itself. This is called insertion loss, and it describes the way that signals degrade just by having a connector attached to them. You always want to use as few connectors as possible, and attaching adapters to a splitter is a great way to make sure that you've got a lot less signal than you were really hoping. Even if the insertion loss is 1 dB on each one of these adapters, that means the total insertion loss is 3 dB because you just add them all together. That's how that stuff works. And that means that you've lost another 50% of your signal just by adding adapters. No, it's much better to use splitters that are intended for the job. And don't just use a splitter that looks like it would be intended or, for example, that the connectors fit. A perfect example are the nodes that are used by Dish Network and the swim splitters that are used by DirecTV. These look like just general purpose splitters, but instead of being general purpose splitters, they have a very specific purpose, and they let certain kinds of signals go in ways that they would not normally go. A DirecTV splitter, for example, is designed to let all of the ports, if this is an 8-way splitter, I mean all 9 ports, talk directly to each other without going back to some other multi-switch or something like that. That's a great piece of technology, and it works to let the Genie system supply programming to a lot of different devices at the same time. Unfortunately, this very same thing can cause feedback to travel up the line if you're using it for something that it's not intended to. This low port isolation, as they call it, can be a problem if you try to use the same splitter for an antenna. And that's why, even though a swim splitter from DirecTV is a lot more expensive than the cheapest splitter that you can get for an antenna, believe it or not, it's that cheaper splitter that is going to work even better for an antenna. I'd love to tell you a lot more about splitters, and I'm going to suggest that if you're interested in the topic, that you go to the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com, and search for splitters, because I've got a number of articles on what makes a good splitter and what's the difference between a splitter and a diplexer, which I could go into, and that would take probably another 5 minutes to talk about. What's a tap, which is a specific kind of splitter in a way. And all of this stuff is out there. Like I said, blog.solidsignal.com. Please check it out. And while you're in the mood to do some clicking, please like this video, subscribe. That makes my numbers look better and makes me look better to management. Share the video to other folks who you thought might be finding this a little more interesting. And come back next week for another edition of the Solid Signal Podcast.